thank you very much for coming to this InConversation with Sagar Gubbi. We will run a program. I'm going to give you an introduction to OxCAN for a couple of minutes, and then introduce our speaker. And well, it's an interview, so I'll introduce the speaker and then go through some questions. It's wonderful that you're able to join us. OxCAN is an alumni organization of the University of Oxford. It was set up in 2021, and now over such a short period of time, we have more than 2,000 members spanning the globe. Most of the members are alumni of the university, and those of you who are attending who are alumni of the university, encouraged to join via our website, which can be found by just probably best Googling OxCAN and climate. And we also include through our LinkedIn presence many members who are not alumni of the university. Our objective is to communicate climate information not just to the alumni. We're trying to focus on some of the things that are happening in Oxford and some of the things that are happening with our alumni members. But we really want to have a broad church and include everyone. And so to do that, if you want to go to our LinkedIn page, you're very welcome to join and follow that. And the things that we do in OxCAN are made available there. The objective of OxCAN really is to create a network of people who are working in the climate space, and also to express and share some of the things that are happening at the university. So it's a tool for communication in both directions. We have some connections with student groups, and we've done recently a mentoring program to help students who are considering a career in climate to speak and meet up with people who are working in the field, and that's been tremendously successful. We have a monthly newsletter that is sent out that is once again a broad church, in which I hope, as the editor, that there's something in it for everyone. And we have a range of blogs and podcasts that are being produced. The InConversation that we're having today will be on our YouTube channel, and so you're able to look through that and afterwards and share that with other people. So I'm hoping that Sagar is available. Sagar Gubbi is the CEO of Ecoforge, and he's eminently well placed to provide some insight into what's happening in emerging economies, especially Southeast and South Asia. He's in Chennai at the moment, trying to get through some traffic, but hopefully by the time I finish my spiel, he might be available. If not directly available, he'll be as a phone link and then switch over to a visual link when he's able to do so. And we're going to be exploring some questions relating to climate finance, looking at some of the challenges that can be encountered in investment in emerging economies, especially, as I said, in South and Southeast Asia, how you overcome them, looking at the demand for investment in sustainable investment, and looking at issues to do with blended finance and other innovative financing mechanisms. So that's a little bit about Sagar, who I'm hoping to introduce to you directly now if he's available. Sagar, are you online?
I guess Andrew, in a couple of minutes, he'll be coming on the video.
Okay, all right.
Could we start? Or I'm just literally working with my apartment, so it should be in about a couple of minutes.
Okay, all right. Well, why don't you get settled and then join as soon as you're able. Okay. Yes. So OxCAN was, as I said, established in 2021. We've had a meteoric rise in terms of membership. We have a very strong board of trustees and a very strong executive committee that are committed to providing a lot of services and information flow from OxCAN. And please do have a look on our website and as I said, join if you're an alumni and connect via LinkedIn. We have a new recruit who's about to launch a series of podcasts, which we're very much looking forward to. Her plan is to interview key players in the climate sphere, and we also have a blog that is being created and is beginning to land on the website. So please have a look at those things. From a housekeeping point of view, if you have questions, please put them into the chat. Gautam, who's here from OxCAN, he will moderate those questions and then ask those questions to Sagar towards the end of the session. And we find that that's the best way, just to consolidate the questions that are being asked. So and we will also at the end share a link just to get some feedback about the webinar, the InConversation, just so that you can give us some feedback about whether you found it useful and what other suggestions you might have for things that we could focus on in the future. All right. Hopefully Sagar is available. Okay. I think we might be in business.
In the interim, Andrew.
Alan, yeah.
Yeah, maybe I think the subject matter that we're going to be discussing today is of a lot of interest to a lot of people. I think climate finance is an area that many developers are always looking to understand. Raising money for projects is a challenge.
Absolutely.
What are some of your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I think Sagar is available now. So thank you, Alan. Alan is our transport director and delighted to have him with us here today. Sagar.
Right. So over to me.
Yes. So I've given you a bit of an introduction, and because we're running a little bit behind, we might go straight into it, unless you wanted to say anything to preface the questions that we go through.
No, I think we're good to go. Apologies everyone for the delay. Normally it takes me 20 minutes to get home. Today it's about an hour and a half because of the rains and the traffic. So apologies again. So I was listening in. I was on my phone. So I think Andrew's already given a great introduction. So I think we can just get straight into it.
Okay. So the first thing I wanted to discuss was really to look at the challenges. When we're looking at climate finance, there are lots of impediments. Climate change in itself is difficult enough, let alone the complexities of dealing with investment and governments and so on. So the first thing is, what are the biggest challenges in securing climate finance for projects in the geographies that you've been working in, and how do you overcome them? So what are the problems and how do you deal with them?
Right. I think that's a great question to start off, Andrew. I think the first and the biggest challenge with regards to access to climate finance is that there is not enough of it, not even close to what we need, right? So if you look at Paris Agreement, well, actually, if you look at the Copenhagen COP in 2009, which aimed to mobilize $100 billion worth of climate finance per annum by 2025, which was reinforced in the Paris Agreement. We are nowhere close to it today, and we are in 2025 now. So $100 billion per annum in climate finance transferred from developed economies to developing economies per annum was what was agreed upon, but we're nowhere close. And we have this recent withdrawal from the global aid and development sector from the US and also potentially from the UK and a few European governments. So the future looks really bleak. The development banks, including the Asian Development Bank, EBRD, World Bank, etc., they do seem to be trying, and some of them even publishing reports that the $100 billion target has been met, but that's something to be taken with a pinch of salt, because a lot of non-climate projects are also often tagged as climate. So on the ground practitioner experience, there is not enough of it. We probably have just about 20-25% of the 100 billion number that we were supposed to meet today. So basically, we don't have enough of it. And in the 10 years since since Paris Agreement was signed, the problem of climate change has worsened. So today, $100 billion also is not sufficient, which was supposed to be agreed upon at the Baku climate conference last year, where developing countries were pushing for $1 trillion per annum type of number, but eventually they agreed to $300 billion per annum by 2030. But again, with what's going on geopolitically and globally today, I don't think that's going to be reached as well. So the bottom line is that there is not enough climate finance as necessary, number one, coming in from the public sector, basically from the governments, which was supposed to come in, is not coming in. So that's the big problem. In the absence of public sector, we need more private sector capital to come in. There is a good amount of private sector capital that's gone into renewables in the last 15 years, which is quite promising, not just in the developed economies, but also in the developing economies, especially the middle income ones like China, India, South Africa, Mexico, Colombia, Brazil as well, and Philippines and Vietnam and Thailand. So a lot of the middle income developing countries have definitely brought in quite a bit of private sector capital into renewables. But beyond the renewable energy success story, the other sectors are really lagging behind in terms of attracting private sector capital. So I think the key challenges is there is not enough public capital, there's not enough private sector capital going into climate finance, given the scale of the problem that's facing us today. So in this context, the key challenges are, of course, the usual suspects. There isn't an enabling policy and regulatory environment in many of the countries, except again, maybe renewables. Many of the other sectors focused on, say, e-mobility, circular economy, waste management, climate change adaptation, resilience. There is not enough enabling policy regulatory mechanisms in place. There isn't enough investment de-risking mechanisms in place, either from the public sector or from the development banks. There is also significant challenge of capacity, institutional capacity at the government level. First, to formulate the right policies and regulations is not there, with the exception of a few countries. And then the second bit is, again, even if you formulate some policies and regulations that may be considered enabling, there isn't enough capacity to implement it at the government and institutional level. And then on the private sector as well, they face huge challenges with regards to finding the right kind of talent and people to execute and to invest in climate climate-related infrastructure, climate impact infrastructure. So I think the problems are across the board: policies, regulations, institutional capacity, lack of private sector capital, and this situation and the challenges, they just get amplified when you go from middle-income countries to LDCs, the least developed countries, where and also when you go to SIDS countries, small island developing states. So these countries are the most affected by climate change, LDCs and SIDS, but they are least prepared and they're receiving the least amount of support to be able to attract climate finance. So, the problem is relatively okay in middle-income countries, but still nowhere close to where it should be. And as you go into the LDCs and SIDS, the problem becomes a lot more complicated. So I would say these are some of the challenges. Yeah.
Is that because the infrastructure in those countries is potentially less reliable? What is the vector there?
The challenge in SIDS and the challenge in small island developing states and LDCs is that government capacity is really limited, right, in terms of institutional capacity. But the bigger issue is also that these are relatively small economies, which means that they also have very small tax base, and hence government revenues are very, very small. And in many of the LDCs and SIDS countries, they just one natural disaster away from bankruptcy, the governments, and that's actually happened in Tuvalu, in Tonga, in Malawi, and many countries, right? So there's this one typhoon, one cyclone, one earthquake, and the country is basically facing sovereign defaults, right? So the tax base is very limited, so they don't have enough financial capacity as well, and most of these countries are also below investment grade in terms of the sovereign credit rating, right? So that also makes it challenging to attract private sector investments from global investors. And on top of all this, because they are unable to attract sort of more commercial investments due to their lack of financial capacity, they are also unable to offer attractive SOPs for private sector. Like, for example, in India, for electric buses for public transport, there's a very generous subsidy program available, right? So you can get up to 30% of the upfront cost of an electric bus as a subsidy from the national government. And then on top of it, you can also lease the buses out to public sector bus transport operators. So for the investor, it's a no-brainer today. But that's because Government of India has enough financial resources and technical capacity to implement such a policy. But if you go to, say, a Malawi, if you go to a Liberia, or if you go to, say, Tanzania, government, one, doesn't have enough resources to offer such SOPs. And two, they don't have enough institutional capacity to implement such policies. So private sector just doesn't come and invest in electric buses for public transport in these countries, right? So all of this together means that if you want to make climate impact in LDCs and in SIDS countries, you need to provide more grants, right? And not necessarily like equity and debt investments. And that again comes back to my original point of there isn't enough public sector, but private sector is not going to offer grants, so that's out of question. Public sector has to offer grants to the LDCs and SIDS countries, and that just isn't available in the scale that we require. So a lot of the LDCs and SIDS are being left out of critical climate investments, which is really a sad situation today.
How are you mentioned before about the changing political climate in the US having a knock-on effect on investment. How do you see that unfolding? I mean, it's been a pretty cataclysmic change, but can you tell us a little bit about the impact of that?
So the impact is already being seen. Like, for example, USAID basically was shut down, and I think they canceled or I think 5-10 billion worth of projects worldwide. A significant chunk of them were climate projects. But at the same time, there's been sort of aid cuts from the UK and Germany, which have been announced as well. So, I mean, we haven't still seen the full effect, the full impact of the cuts, because it's been just 2 months, 3 months. And some of the funds for some of the projects were committed before the cuts were announced, and I'm guessing some of them are still continuing this year. But I think we'll start to see a stronger impact from 2026 onwards. To start with, I think some of the global climate funds, right? We have the Green Climate Fund, we have the Global Environment Facility, the Climate Investment Fund, and then a few other smaller ones like Adaptation Fund and Mitigation Action Facility, etc. So their next cycle of replenishment is going to be affected. Jeff 8 is now implementation phase, but they started the Jeff 9 Global Environment Facilities 9th cycle replenishment this year, and it's not looking good. They need, I think they were planning to hit a 3 billion to 3.5 billion USD fund commitments, but I don't think they're going to reach that. GCF2 was replenished in 2022-23, so that's another 12 billion US dollar worth of fund, the Green Climate Fund, Fund 2. So they are in the implementation phase. So they will probably have enough resources to deploy for the next 2 to 3 years at least. But from 2027-28 onwards, I think they'll also fail to replenish their GCF Fund 3, for example. So all of this, will mean that less and less of projects will get funded in the next 3, 4, 5 years. And even if there is a reversal of some of these aid cuts at some point, it'll take a few years for all of the funding to come back and then all of the projects to be funded. So we're looking at a big hole in the climate finance needs. We're probably going to be lower than what we had last year. In 2024, I think the estimation was that about 30 to 35 billion USD of climate finance was invested in developing countries. I think 26-27, we're probably going to have half of it. And that means a lot more projects are not going to be funded.
So how are local governments responding to this situation? What are they doing? You alluded to the fact that they often don't have the funding or the bandwidth or the strength to support a lot of the projects that are actually required. Are there innovations afoot? Are there countries grouping together? Are there, what are some of the things that are happening to address this kind of challenge from their point of view?
That's a great question again, Andrew. I think countries are innovating because the problem of climate change is not going away, right? And in many countries, it's a question of survival. In the SIDS countries, for example, right? And of course, in the middle income countries as well, like India, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa. Again, they experience the negative impacts of climate change on a daily basis. So there is innovation. So for example, one of the projects we are working on is to set up a climate resilience financing facility for the city of Lagos in Nigeria, with the Development Bank of Nigeria as the investment partner that we are working with, and with some small amount of funding from Green Climate Fund and UN agencies. So there, the GCF portion of the investment is going to be very small. So the plan is to have a $250 million fund, and the Green Climate Fund is going to potentially contribute just about 50 million. The rest, the state government of Lagos, as you know, is the wealthiest and the most populated city in all of Africa. Climate challenges there are ridiculously high. The city floods every year. There's massive water shortages. Wastewater treatment is a huge issue. Flooding, of course, is a big issue. The sea level rise and seas encroaching into the land, and the people living right on the coast. So it's a huge challenge, right? So they realize this is a huge challenge, and they realize that not as much of climate finance from the developed countries is coming in. So the state government of Lagos, they have enough tax revenues. So Nigeria is a middle income country. In fact, it's getting into upper middle income status. So the state government of Lagos has enough credit worthiness, and they're using that to issue green bonds and blue bonds in the domestic market. So state government of Lagos will issue green bonds and blue bonds in the domestic market and use the proceeds to finance urban climate resilient infrastructure in Lagos, right? So they're doing that. And there is enough capital, there is enough interest if you structure the blue bonds and the green bonds in the right way, right? That's one example. The other example I can give you is what's happening in here in India. So the e-mobility program that I talked about, it's called FAME, and it's a combination of incentive packages for public transport operators to deploy electric buses on a lease basis. And it also has incentives for manufacturers to manufacture electric buses in India, and also manufacture the entire battery ecosystem. Right. So this is basically not funded by any climate funds or international sources, entirely funded by Government of India taxation. And then on the third thing that I can talk about is, the Development Bank of Southern Africa, which is also a client of ours, is utilizing a small amount of a Global Environment Facility funding, which would act as the structured finance stack for energy efficiency financing. As you know, South Africa is a very, very energy intense economy. Their energy intensity of GDP is probably one of the highest in the world. So energy efficiency is a low hanging fruit in South Africa. So they are using a small amount of Global Environment Facility funding to be utilized as the highest risk junior tranche in the intercapital stack as first loss default guarantee. And then the Development Bank is also bringing its own capital and it's Government of South Africa own Development Bank, right? So they are bringing in their own capital as the second loss. So they are slightly higher in the structured finance stack. And then commercial banks are bringing in their loans on top of all of this. So essentially, the small amount of global climate funding from GEF and the capital from DBSA are de-risking commercial bank lending to industries for energy efficiency retrofits. And the goal is to bring $500 million of commercial bank financing over the next 5 years using this small amount of de-risking that we are working on, right? So there's a lot of innovation in the financial side as well. Of course, on the technology side also, there's a lot of R&D and innovation happening. And it's really heartening to see emerging markets looking at it in a very innovative way without having to wait for global climate funds to come in.
But what's going to happen to, it's all well and good to talk about those economies that have some substance to them, even though their problems are enormous. But what about the small island developing states? Who's going to solve some of their problems, and are they bonding together to find to create collectives? What solution is there for Kiribati and Tuvalu and short of shipping them all to Australia?
I mean, yeah, that's a very good question. Unfortunately, I honestly haven't seen a lot of bringing together of the Pacific Islands to pull in resources of their own. There is some of that happening in the Indian Ocean region. There's an organization called the IOREC, the Indian Ocean Regional Cooperation Organization, and they are mobilizing some capital In the Pacific Islands as well, there are a couple of organizations that are mobilizing some capital in partnership with some bilateral partners. So for the Indian Ocean region, Government of India is financing some investments, and the rest is coming from the country governments themselves. In the Pacific Islands, there's some funding from the Japanese government as well, and some from the US government and Australian government. But then the island countries are also trying to pull in resources specifically around renewables. So for example, there's a fairly large Australian government program that also has about 30% co-finance from the Pacific Island Corporation. And there's like thousands of islands, and a lot of them are powered by diesel.
Yeah.
So solarizing them is a no-brainer, but you need upfront capital. Thankfully, some Australian and Japanese government funding is coming in together with some amount of co-finance from the governments. But honestly, it's not enough. There's still a lot to do. The bigger challenge, of course, in the SIDS countries is coastal resilience, especially around building seawalls to prevent sea level rise, and then also potentially working on ensuring the seawater doesn't mix with the water. Yeah, I think that investments are still lacking. I do hope they come through sooner rather than later. But yeah, at the moment, to be honest, there isn't enough information. There isn't enough investments going into those kind of activities.
And some of those countries potentially looking at strategic locations with China even, and putting them into a kind of a different kind of state. Look, that's really interesting. We haven't got a lot of time. We're only getting through half of this. So the role of blended finance. We talked already a little bit about funding and grants as opposed to investment. And can you tell us a little bit about how these finance packages, the blending is operating, and what options there might be through blending to actually make some of these projects get off the ground?
Absolutely. So I think blended finance, if used in the right way, is a great tool. But then again, there's not a lot of experience in structuring blended finance instruments in the right way. So the South African example I talked about is one such example that we are working on. So you bring just about $15 million of capital from the Global Environment Facility and from the DBSA, which is the Government of South Africa institution, and you leverage that by offering first loss and second loss default guarantees. So basically, the public capital, which is in the form of junior tranche and then the second loss tranche from the public side of things, bringing in only $15 or $17 million, can leverage $500 million of commercial capital from the banks, right? So that's a great example of leveraging public capital for bringing in private investments. And that's exactly what blended finance is supposed to do. You use a limited amount of public capital to leverage private sector investments, right? So that's one example. Another example from what I could see in, I think this is I think this was a catalytic finance, green finance facility that the Asian Development Bank implemented for Southeast Asia. It's called the Asia Catalytic Green Finance Facility. So the goal there is for ADB's own funding to act as a sort of a de-risking and catalytic instrument and not direct investments. So one of the examples of this facility that we worked on in Vietnam in 2018 was to de-risk investments into utility scale solar. So Vietnam was a bit of a latecomer to the solar party in Asia, as you may, especially in the middle income country list. And the power purchase agreement that was offered by the government-owned utility in Vietnam was not considered bankable because it did not have the take or pay clause, which is a key clause that makes a PPA bankable, right? But Vietnam was a huge market and a huge opportunity to de-risk and decarbonize Vietnam's power sector. So it was not, ADB and others were not willing to let go of this opportunity just because the PPA was not bankable for private investors. So the Asia Catalytic Green Finance Facility structured the debt sculpting in such a way that in case there is no take, in case there is no, the utility doesn't take the electricity generated by a solar power plant and hence doesn't pay, then there is a facility that's built inside the debt structure that could come in and ensure that the debt default doesn't happen, right? So that structures again has been very helpful. And after that, you've seen what happened in Vietnam. It's now among the top 4 countries in Asia in terms of installed solar power capacity. So that's exactly what public capital is supposed to do by leveraging and de-risking private sector investments. And these are all great examples of blended finance structures.
Can I ask, you're obviously the CEO of Ecoforge and have developed quite a lot of experience running that company. Can you give us some sort of real examples of how you've overcome some of the barriers or difficulties that you've put in your way in the operation of your company?
Of operating my own company, or should I talk about some of the projects we worked on?
Yeah, the projects you've worked on, and I mean, at the end of the day, we're just trying to get some real examples of specific projects that we can, use as case studies. Yeah.
Yeah. So one example I can talk about is a credit guarantee fund that we structured here in India, Andrew. It's called the risk sharing facility that we structured for the German government funded program on waste management, specifically on organic waste management. As you know, organic waste that just goes into the landfills ends up with a lot of methane emission, and methane is 24 times as potent as carbon dioxide in terms of global warming potential. So eliminating methane is a huge opportunity to create climate impact, while also you can use methane in a productive way, right? So financing such projects was a no-brainer, but the banks in India, as in many other countries, were very, very skeptical because equity investors, especially early stage equity investors, they embrace risk and they invest for growth, whereas banks, they invest to minimize risks, right? So they're always very, very risk averse. So the banks needed some level of public sector de-risking, and that's when we brought in the Credit Guarantee Fund that the GIZ, German government institution, brought in. And we brought one of the Government of India owned institutions to be the guarantor / fund manager for this guarantee fund. And this we set up in 2021 with a modest capitalization of 5 million euros. And within 3 years, it has already leveraged over 1.2x of that. And the 5 million euros is still there, not used, but banks have lent about 5.3 million euros worth of loans for the waste management methane emission reduction projects in India. And the tenor is still for 3 more years, so it's going to easily reach 2.5 to 3x of that leverage from banks, and the 5 million euros from the German government is still going to be intact, right? By bringing in. So this is one project that we're really excited and proud of. And then the other example I can talk about is the sort of energy access pay-as-you-go transactions that we worked on, bringing in access to energy for mini grids and for solar home systems to some of the poorest people in Africa and also in parts of India. So the pay-as-you-go model and also the solar mini grid model financing that we worked on are really high impact, not just from a climate perspective, but also from a social impact perspective, because these are communities that are receiving access to energy for the first time in their lives. So those are some very exciting projects that we worked on. More recently on urban climate resilient infrastructure in Asia's and Africa's mega cities. So we have projects going on in Lagos, like I said. There's one in Johannesburg that we're starting. There's two in Mumbai and Bangalore here that we are starting as well with a bunch of development partners and commercial investors, and also potentially something in Jakarta, Manila, and Bangkok next year. So all of these are very exciting projects that we've been working on.
Well, just going back to the sort of microenergy project in Africa, what did the funding platform for that look like?
Well, a lot of there are quite a few private companies offering solar on a pay-as-you-go model. So just the way you have pay-as-you-go models for purchasing iPhone in developed countries, these rural households can purchase solar on a pay-as-you-go model. So every payment they make also contributes a portion for ownership of these assets, right? So these are typically 6 to 12-month contracts, and the mobile payments are included. The payments are always via mobile payments, with the provision for the systems to be locked out if the payments are missed for a couple of times, right? So basically, it's a commercial model here that a lot of solar companies are offering. And they raised development capital as equity. They raised debt capital as from the development banks, some grants to make it more affordable to some of the poorest population. But a lot of it is actually quite commercial. And 6 to 12 months later, the system completely unlocks, and the household basically owns it for the next 10 years without having to pay anything.
And that's household by household. It's not small settlement by small settlement. It's household by household.
Mainly household by household, but there are also some mini grid models that are following the similar situation where it's for a community rather than for each household.
Just out of interest, what is the sort of cost platform for a household for a solar generation system?
Oh, well, these are packages actually. So a small solar panel ranging from anything from 10 watt peak to 100 watt peak to 200 watt peak, and they couple it with LED lights and DC fans and DC TVs, right? So it's a package that they sell, costing anywhere between $200 to $1,000. The $1,000 being, of course, at the high end, but most of them cost for $200 to $400. And the households make a small down payment of about 5% upfront, and then they get the system, and it starts installed, and it starts providing them with the necessary electricity, and then they make monthly payments. Part of it for using the system, and part of it for ownership.
Sagar, look, thank you very much. I know that Gautam has a whole swathe of questions from the people who are attending. So I'm going to hand over to him just to moderate some of the questions or pull them together to address.
Thanks. Thank you, Andrew. And thanks, Sagar, for the wonderful session. And thanks, everyone, for the questions. We've got only about 10 to 15 minutes. So I would try to see how many questions that we can complete. So the one question is from Vikramjit. So the question is, what is the broad flow of climate finance from UK, US, and Europe to India? Is there something that can be done to increase this flow? This question is from Vikram.
It's a great question, Vikram. I think I would say the flow is probably just about I would say it's probably less than $1 billion, maybe even less these days, from all of Europe, UK, US put together. Coming into India is probably $1 billion or less, maybe even closer to $500 million, maybe $500 million. So it's not a lot. So a lot of the climate investments in India are happening either from Government of India, from its own resources. And the Government of India is able to mobilize resources for climate, either through market borrowings or through its own tax accruals. But there's also quite a bit of private sector investments that is happening into the climate sectors in India. Some of that private sector is, of course, domestic. The big conglomerates, Adani, the Reliance, Renew Power, they're Indian, and they're investing in renewables. But there's also a lot of Western private sector companies that have invested quite heavily into renewables, into e-mobility sectors in India, right? So I think if you take the private sector climate finance flows into consideration into India, coming from Europe, UK, North America, then I think the flow becomes bigger. But just from the public sector side of US, UK, Europe, it's not a big amount. A lot of it is actually coming from the government of India. We can do a lot to increase the flow. I think government is doing quite a bit. The private sector in India is also doing quite a bit, but we can do a lot more. I think one of the things that Indian companies can do is to go into European and UK and US markets on road shows and mobilize capital. There's a lot of appetite. We went on a roadshow ourselves last year and the year before when we were looking at raising our own climate finance fund. There's a lot of untapped funding available from European and even American family offices. That's a big chunk that's not been tapped yet. So I think targeting family offices is one big opportunity. Also targeting large corporations who are looking to make commercial investments into climate finance sectors, whether it's in renewables, whether it's in e-mobility, whether it's in waste management, is also another untapped opportunity. And of course, bringing in more de-risking investments de-risking instruments is also another opportunity. So we can do a lot more. And in my opinion, I think we should really target private sector, family office, and corporations in the West to bring in more climate finance into India, because public sector money is not going to be significant going forward.
Okay, thanks, Sagar. The next question is from Sangram. So the question is, what kind of partners are necessary for success in climate finance, and what kind of projects other than renewables are attractive and have the highest possibility of funding?
Great question. I think two things. So when I talk about partners and projects, I'm actually talking about actual climate impact assets, right? I'm not really talking about sort of climate tech startups, because climate tech startups have their own risk profile and they attract more of venture capital type of investments. But when we talk about infrastructure projects that have a climate impact, I think two very important things is what's the strength of the balance sheet of the parent company or the project sponsor, whoever is basically building, owning, and operating those projects, right? So their financial strength and strength of the balance sheet is extremely important, because still outside of renewables, as you ask, pure project finance is still very rare. So most of the financing is corporate finance. So basically the financing is happening based on the balance sheet strength of the project sponsor. So that's an extremely important consideration. And then the second bit is just the project itself. It should be bankable, right? Bankability and creditworthiness of the project is extremely important, which is why I think structuring the right kind of policy de-risking instruments in the form of, say, guaranteed offtake, price guarantees, payment guarantees would go a long way. And then financial de-risking as well. So policy de-risking, financial de-risking can go a long way in increasing bankability of these projects. So I think these two will be the most critical aspects of making sure that these projects are able to achieve financial close.
Thanks, Sagar. Next question is from Priscilla. So she says, thank you for your support. Can you name some innovative initiatives in Southeast Asia?
Yeah. So the Asia Catalytic Green Finance Facility I talked about that the Asian Development Bank has set up is very innovative. It's the innovation in that model is that it's focused on ASEAN basically, and the goal is to de-risk private sector investments and never directly invest itself. But at the same time, it provides the flexibility that the facility can offer credit guarantees, partial credit guarantees, first loss default guarantees, credit enhancements for bond issuances, payment guarantees in case there isn't enough policy payment guarantees available and things like that. So I think the flexibility and the point and the fact that they're de-risking private investments of that facility is very, very innovative. I think there was also a very interesting model in Thailand on tariffs for renewables, which was one of the earliest feed-in tariff model where it wasn't a straight-up feed-in tariff, but only an adder mechanism. It was just adding an additional incentive for renewables over and above fossil fuel based tariffs. So that was also a very innovative policy instrument introduced almost a decade ago.
Okay, thanks, Sagar. Next question is from Alan. So the question is, what are the key interventions being pursued to get private funding, participation in climate action?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that's being done. Private sector investments into renewables, especially in middle income and nowadays even in low income countries, is quite heartening. There's a lot of investments going in. There's still a lot to bring in, but at the very least, it's happening. But the big challenge right now is in bringing private sector investments into the climate change adaptation and resilience space, right? Because traditionally, mitigation projects like renewables and e-mobility, they have strong commercial and revenue generation potential, and hence they are easy to attract private sector investments into those sectors. But when it comes to adaptation and resilience, like for example, building seawalls, right? Who's going to generate revenue from it? Or say building a nature-based infrastructure like an urban forest or a watershed management project or enhancing stormwater drain capacity in cities. So these are all climate change adaptation and resilience infrastructure measures. But how are you actually going to generate any commercial potential from it? So that's why attracting private sector investments into adaptation and resilience has been very difficult so far. But there are ways of doing it. Like, for example, for nature-based solutions in urban centers, there is a model that's available from Quito in Ecuador, where the city government, together with the government of Ecuador, have structured a land value capture modality, where investing in nature-based solutions in a city, it enhances the property prices of all the properties located around the urban forest, for example. So public investment in forests in a city, urban forests, is actually benefiting private side because a lot of the real estate is owned by the private sector. So is there a way to ensure some of those private sector gains are sort of flowing back to the public sector? So there is a PPP modality at least. So these are some measures. Land value capture modality for, say, public transport, green transport, and nature-based solutions is one way. Credit guarantees is of course one way. First loss guarantees, credit guarantees is the other way. Sometimes just funding the project development process can also go a long way, because that's when most of the risk is, and later on you can just allow takeout financing to come in. So these are some measures that could really go a long way.
Thank you. We are almost coming to the closer, maybe another 1 minute for the last question, which is from Yagi. So do you see the voluntary carbon credit market as important source of finance? Do you see it growing?
Honestly, no. So we personally initially started looking at the carbon markets during the Kyoto era, before the Kyoto Protocol lapsed in 2012, which was a compliance market, and then of course the Article 6 from Paris Agreement has finally been operationalized as of 2023. So in the interim between 2012 and 2023, the global carbon markets were dominated by the voluntary markets, under gold standard, VCS, etc. And they have all had their own challenges on the trust factor in terms of the VCS and gold standards. The infamous Guardian article from 2023 about VCS and gold standard projects being not up to the mark in terms of the trust factor is still quite fresh in everybody's mind. So I personally don't think going forward voluntary carbon markets are going to be a big part. But thankfully, Article 6 has been operationalized of Paris Agreement, and we see more and more of the compliance carbon markets coming into picture as part of the 2030 targets of Paris Agreement. And I think there's a push towards bringing in the trust factor into the carbon markets, especially in Article 6 compliance markets. So on the carbon side, I would see the Article 6 compliance markets as a big source of carbon and climate finance going forward, and not the voluntary markets. But again, that's my personal opinion, and we'll see how things go in the next few years.
Thanks, Sagar. And so that's all we have for the question. Thanks to everyone for the question. And now for the closing remarks, I hand it over to Andrew again.
Thank you, Gautam. Look, I think this has been a fantastic session, and I, for one, have so much more understanding about the dynamics of climate finance, especially in emerging markets, and some of the challenges. I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I hope people who've been here found that useful. I don't know whether Gautam has been able to put the evaluation into the chat, but if you get a chance to follow that up, that would be useful for us. Sagar, I just want to thank you very much for devoting some time, and we've spent quite a few meetings preparing this, and just very, very grateful to you. And hopefully we could do a follow-up from this at some point. But I think just looking at the comments and hearing the questions, it's pushed forward quite a lot of interest, and just shows how much people are thirsty for information in this field. So on behalf of the executive committee and the members of OxCAN, thank you very, very much for your time. It's been a pleasure having you, and thank you to Gautam as well for organizing things in the back end. And we'll draw this to a close. If you get a chance to fill in that form just to give us some feedback, it's just in the chat now, that would be really useful. And until next time, please keep an eye on our website and our LinkedIn for further events. We're focusing on things that are a lot more related to this area, and so we'd like to see you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Closing.
It's great to be on this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.